Welcome, Rebels, in this episode.
So around language, I think that is when there is a response that feels negative. What the communication is really saying, I don't fit that narrative, or I don't fit that definition of what, and it could be a misunderstanding too of what that means. And so one of the things like that we give around a lot of times in the work that I do professionally, people always ask like, well, what's the terminology? We went through this whole idea of like political correctness, which doesn't even exist, but like our, and I will say really our government has made us believe that we have this political correctness. And it's like, so people are really afraid to use words. And really it's like, how do you see yourself? And really, again, going back to that connection and taking the time to really understand someone's experience and how they want and choose to identify.
You're listening to the Red Couch Rebels, a safe, comfy space for vulnerability and self-growth. I'm Jenny.
And I'm Erin.
We are seekers and self-advocates.
Yeah, we're not your doctors.
Or your therapists.
No, we're just fellow seekers on our own journeys of self-discovery.
Explore your inner rebel with us.
Let's sink in.
All right. Well, let's jump right on into this part 2. Loved our explorations in part 1, and we're gonna pick right back up with the conversations, I think, around stories and just the work that you're doing to advocate and have very intentional conversations that I think people don't know how to have or are afraid to have, that are so critical and important to moving together as teams, as friends, as organizations, as a nation. I mean, there's so much potential here that we need to, we're gonna maybe not solve it today, but let's dive in.
Yeah,
Let's keep our aspirations high. We might be able to solve it today.
I suppose. I mean, coming off of the last conversation, this is the space to dream big. Absolutely.
Well, and it's all seeds, right?
Yeah.
That's it. We're just planting seeds and growing our intention and through understanding. And one place that I would love to start with, if you're good with it, is language. So around and my son is literally jumping on his bed upstairs right now. So if y'all can hear that, that's my kiddo.
That's awesome.
So the language around DEIB, I find it so challenging. And like, obviously, full disclosure, if anybody's watched our videos, you know that we are 2 white women that live in rural Wisconsin, right? So like, we fully acknowledge that we don't have a full spectrum of understanding of experience, but in our hearts, we support. And I'm even struggling to find words right now because I don't know what words are acceptable, because advocates is let's use that as a word, right? Like, advocates, we're advocates, allies. Okay. So all of that. My daughters are 21 now and they are biracial. And I hear from them that they don't want that word. Like, like this young generation, they don't want that. There's something about that word that is triggering to them. I'm like, I don't even know what word to use then. Like, it's gotten to the point where it's like, I don't even know how to communicate about the topic because I'm bound to trigger somebody.
Yeah. And I think that's a real struggle right now. I do think that there's a lot of fear around language. And I think as people have been in the struggle around equity and equality, everyone's trying to find their own. So it's like that fight is coming out, and I think it's being projected out, and really it's a reflection of pain or hurt or frustration within. And it's the only way, because when someone's referring to language, right, like that can be very personal for people. And so it's like that's kind of the place where it gets, I'll say attacked is a strong word, but like that's where it's like, oh, I'm going to put up the fight here. But really it's reflective, I believe, of like a bigger societal, like, I don't find my place, I don't know where I belong, and the only way I know how to tell you that is by making a response to language you've used, because that's the only thing I can do at this moment, if that makes sense. And kind of diving in a little bit, deeper is I truly believe like behavior is communication, right? And so like how we act is like is communication. And so as we mature as people throughout our own life cycle, our behavior changes because we have different tools in which we can communicate, whether it be our vocabulary, our language, or whatnot. And so the other thing about language is like language does change and evolve. And because our identity is so personal to us, and as a nation, we haven't done as much learning as we probably should have individually and then collectively. We have made systems around identification. So there's a difference
Yeah.
of identification and identity. And so identification are the systems of when you go to register, you talk about your children, register them for school, when you go to submit your job application, when you go to whatever and you have all the boxes, that's identification. And so our government has been very involved in, identification, and our systems have been very involved in identification. And so what that has done is started to put people in boxes. You have to identify, is it this box or this box you're going to check? And so that's been this like constant process of box checking. And I think so as individuals who've done and have learned and want to engage more around their own identity and have realized I don't fit into a box, our whole topic around that like inner rebel, right, is like this is a place that I can show up to tell you I don't belong here. And
Mm.
so then it creates conflict as well, because I think people are trying to be well-meaning, well-intentioned. They're people they love and care about, and they're trying to do the right thing. And so by getting that response back, it then becomes hurtful too. It's like, well, wait, I'm trying to do the right thing here, and it still feels like the wrong thing. And so what I
Yeah.
would say around language is that one, identity is so personal, and there are many ways in which people identify that maybe aren't even terms or vocabulary that we use readily. If I think about one of the questions I get a lot is around like LGBTQIA identities, like the language is always changing. There's so many terms, there's so many things. And it's like that, I think, in a more recent understanding of identity, gender identity, fluidity, the gender spectrum, sexuality, and the spectrum. I think because we've spent so much time around box checking, that has been populations of people say, nope, I don't fit in that box. I don't fit in this box. And then there's been new terms like, this is really what it is. Oh, nope, that's not really me. Now this is really what it is. And I think it's been one that's been one layer of identity that's been more fluid. And so we have created several new terms for people because they don't fit into the box that we've identified, made an identification, like a label and a definition. Like, this is what it means to be this identity. So the other thing, so around language, I think that is when there is a response that feels negative. What the communication is really saying, I don't fit that narrative, or I don't fit that definition of what, and it could be a misunderstanding too of what that means. Um,
Mhm.
and so one of the things like that we give around a lot of times in the work that I do professionally, people always ask like, well, what's the terminology? We went through this whole idea of like political correctness, which doesn't even exist, but like and I will say really our government has made us believe that we have this political correctness. And it's like, so people are really afraid to use words. And really it's like, how do you see yourself? And really, again, going back to that connection and taking the time to really understand someone's experience and how they and choose to identify. And I think there are some identities that just are not as important to people. And then there's some that are screaming, like, I want you to see me as this identity. So, in my own experience, so you talked about the term that I'll start with because that's where you were sharing around mixed, like being mixed or mixed race. So, I personally identify with that because I really feel like it describes my experience. I grew up with my mom who's white, my dad is black, not as strong of a relationship. And I really, as a kid, part of my seeing the world was this whole racial quandary. Like, I really didn't feel like I fit in. I'm like, oh, I'm too black to be white. I'm too white to be black. There wasn't as much, I would say, of interracial relationships and child producing peers that had a lot of peers that were mixed race. So I now, when I'm in education, I see oh my gosh, there's so many brown kids like that look just like me. But when I was growing up, that wasn't the case. And so I identify as really being mixed. Like Tay Diggs wrote this children's book called like Mixed Me, and so I love it because it's just kind of like you're not really sure where you fit in. And the idea, so another term, and I'll say it as language has changed. I also was told that I was a term called mulatto, which is like a mix,
Oh.
and it's really of it's like of a mule. It's a mule. It comes from mule, which is a cross between a donkey and a horse. And so mulatto comes from that. And mules were like had no value. And so the idea of like mulatto or being mixed, there's an idea that that is like, yeah, you don't really have value because you're mixed. You're not a purebred, which is like this higher value, whatever, if we're talking about whatever we're talking about, like, oh, this pure is something that's more valuable than being mixed. And so then there's been a lot of, I think people not like that's not, I don't want to identify as that. Like, I want to have value and whatnot. So then um we think about just the racial identity, so then there's like multiracial, or everyone say, well, you're biracial. Well, then they're bi is two, and so many people are more than one, so like multiracial.
Mhm.
So I think it really is, so my I share all of that to give the context of like it really is just so personal. Like, people have their own personal understanding of how they show up from, and we're talking about this particular identities around kind of racial identity. And so, and racial identity also can be really fluid. So I feel like I identify with a lot of different terms like black, multiracial, biracial, mixed, as I said. Like, if someone just asked me, the first thing I'll say is mixed, because that really I feel is very central and personal to me. But I identify with all those terms, black and African American as well. And then there's that difference of race is really the color of your skin and your racial identity. But then you also have an ethnic heritage. So like where you have like African
Mhm.
American, which is kind of more around like your corner of the world. And again, our government has put those things together. So black and African
Yeah.
American are one of the same, and they're not one of the same, because you can have black show up black and have black skin or brown skin and not be from an African country, like if you're Haitian or Jamaican, right? So they're different, but we've been told and educated as they're just one of the same. It's just like black or African American. It's like, but some people identify as black and not African American, and vice versa. So
So
usually
then can I ask one
racial,
more question? One
yeah,
question. I'm sorry,
absolutely.
didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
So then what about like culturally? Like there's race,
Hmm.
ethnicity, and then what about culture? Because you're raised by a white woman, just like my daughters were, in a white
Hmm.
family in a very, very rural white community. So what does that considered culture then?
Yeah, so culture really, and in the I guess the definition is really around those shared values, beliefs, traditions. We think about culture can show up in the way of just like what we eat, holidays we might celebrate, or traditions we have, not necessarily holidays if that's only connected to religion, but like maybe or spiritual traditions, kind of the way rules of engagement, and then you start getting into some of those cultural contexts of like even in this conversation, I'm talking, you're listening. Aaron, you're asking permission to interrupt. Some cultures you don't ask permission, you just interrupt and just jump in, right? And so, like, your cultural context and how you're raised gives you information about what those rules are. So culture can look a lot of different ways, and we are constantly in different cultures. So your culture is your like geographic location, right? As you're kind of talking about like a rural area, or a rural or and Midwest. It can be part of race. It can be part of race as well. It can be generational culture. So as we're
Mhm.
now exhibiting the largest span of generations in the workforce, generationally we have culture, and then we kind of make fun of one another of different things, like, oh, different words you use or different habits, or you hear about all these different things, like that just doesn't make fun, but like we point out those differences. Sometimes it's not
Yeah.
funny, and sometimes people can, in my work it is fun, because then we're like, oh yeah, you're this, you're that. um but so with that, um culture can speak to a lot of those things. It's kind of when you think about like when you show up, how do you know how to engage in that environment? That's what your culture is. And again, that could be multiple influences all at the same time. Youth culture, as opposed to like professional culture or whatever. And then professional culture depending on your industry. So I've been and spent a lot of time in education and community. Like those are my two huge sectors. When I spend time in more private business or corporate or government space, I understand there's different cultural rules of engagement. So culture can mean all of those things. And sometimes you hear people talk about like the Black culture. Well, it's cultures because Black doesn't just show up in one way, but some people might,
Mhm.
they identify with it that way. How does that sound or fit or?
No, that helps because like I'm thinking of like I know that who I am and who I showed up as. I'm their adopted mom, but she was your bio mom. Like that's a piece of you, and I was trying to figure out where
Hmm.
if we're teasing this out, not into put in boxes, but the different factors. She clearly, as we discussed in part one, is a huge part of you, right? So it's
Hmm.
like in
Hmm.
those identities, it wasn't showing up. Where traditionally that is where that would show up, right? Because mom
Right.
would probably be identifying as the same ethnicity or race. Yeah.
Yeah, and it can, and I think that you bring in like, and which is why I love this work because it's so complex, right? There's so many different layers. So I think as kids, like your kids typically your cultural values, understanding context, you are raising kids in what you understand to be, and I just the rules of engagement is just like the easiest way, like as like this is the way we do things. And so when you talk about in situations where whether it be blended families, adoptive families, that may have happened at different points of especially again, I'm thinking about parents and children at different points of maturity of development. And so depending on what cultural context happened prior to the current family structure you have now, like that's all adding there. And so one of the things
Mhm.
that I'll give an example is yes, growing up with my biological mom and always seeing that like she's like, I'm a white woman, like you have to know that there are people who are gonna show up differently. And so we were always going to different events, being part of different groups. My neighborhood is very diverse, which I loved, having a lot of different people that I could um get insight, right? And that kind of understanding of like, oh, people are different, like that's awesome. And it wasn't until I was in college till I really identified with, I would say, like my blackness, like my black side. Like I was more, although before that, I was really like around being mixed. And there were like, that was just, again, the quandary. It was just such a quandary of like, where do I fit in? And then I had a lot of friends in college. I was part of Black Student Union. And I realized like, oh, there's this whole other culture that really is rooted in how we, foods that we eat and traditions that we have and um, the ways in which we show up. Because with my dad, my dad's side of the family's from California, and I didn't really know he was mostly in Wisconsin. We didn't have the strongest of relationships, so I didn't spend as much time with him. And his whole family, I didn't really have exposure to, so I didn't see how people kind of who looked more like me, because I looked more probably like him. I looked like a combination, but I didn't see that. But so in college, like I was like, oh, like so that's really where I found my like I would say blackness for me. Like that's where I was like, okay, this is cool. Like there's a whole nother culture. And so now my racial identity I feel is still not as much of a quandary. I feel pretty sure of who I am, but it's very much very fluid. So when I'm in spaces which predict or predominantly has been my career that is mostly white centered, I feel much more black. Like I feel like I'm showing up as a black woman and in like that's the lens I'm looking through. Like I just that's it, and it doesn't. It's not like I'm like I'm black today. It's just like how I show up. I'm like I notice that about myself. And when I'm in bigger multiracial context, so for me professionally, typically it's whether I'm in an affinity group around other like Black educators or Black professionals, or when I'm at conferences or I'm at traveling in bigger cities, I feel much more like mixed race. Like I feel much more like, oh, I'm not, and I want to say not as Black because it's not really, and it's not in comparison to anyone else. It's just like in comparison to my own journey. Like, again, I mean, I was in my 20s when I was like, oh, dang, I really do identify with being Black. Like, that wasn't as much as my first, 20 years of life. It was more about being mixed race or biracial. So that's where I see like my fluidity kind of changes in the context that I'm in, not based on the outward environment, but like just how I kind of show up. Like some of those, again, those habits, cultural, whether it be dress, food, music, whatnot, like that, those are the ways that I see culture. And I'm like, oh, okay, I kind of shift here. And that was kind of more of a recent, understanding of myself, more just in my adulthood, probably in the last probably 15 years. I'm like, oh yeah, like, okay, I see myself showing up differently. Um, which is good. And that's how people can show up differently. Like that's part of identity, and some people maybe don't not choose, but maybe they don't feel like they do. But giving that permission to show up differently and how much information I want to share and how much understanding, and all of that.
Yeah. I think, I mean, to your point, everybody will be different. And I think just noticing like what parts of you are coming forward
Hmm.
or how things are changing depending on the environments and the groups that you're around. I based on some other work that I'm doing, I've been reading some books and doing more self-discovery and education for myself around race. So I've been reading the book White Fragility by
Mm.
Dr. Robin DiAngelo.
D'Angelo. Hmm.
And yeah, and it's great. Aaron always says, "Do you finish the books?" Because I have a bad habit of like
No
starting.
judgment.
No,
I'm
no
just always
judgment.
curious.
No, I have a bad habit of like starting 5 books at a time, or like starting one and 2 weeks later, oh, this one looks really good. I'm gonna start that one. So
Yeah.
anyway, tangent. But anyways, in listening to her talk and share, and she's also a white woman, she talks a lot about this idea of race and how many
Hmm.
white individuals have kind of pushed that away, like, oh, that's not my issue, that's not anything I need to look at because I'm white. But it's like, white is a race. It is
Right.
something we need to look at. And one of the things that was really interesting that she shared was like just noticing how oftentimes, being white myself, I agreed with this. It aligned with my experience. When I go into certain places, I don't even think about
Hmm.
the color of my skin. And for many individuals, whether they're black, brown, mixed, however they identify, that's like something that they notice
Hmm.
immediately. And even, I mean, being real and noticing like when you do walk into an environment where maybe you're the only white person, or there's more black or brown or mixed
Hmm.
individuals around you, like how does that make you feel? And I think most would say there is something there, and instead of pushing it away, look at it,
Mhm.
Lean
ask
into it. Yeah.
questions. Like, your whole thing is get curious about it. I mean, I've learned
Yes.
so much about myself in that. That's so important. And I wasn't
Yeah.
taught this. Many of us weren't taught this.
Right.
Right. Well, and that's the thing, not taught it. And then to have the comfort around just asking questions, and just
Yeah.
asking like we're doing right now and just like connecting, like, oh, okay, how someone else's story may or may not relate. And then you start thinking about, and that's one of the things that I do as people are trying to understand themselves. Like a lot of times we want to learn about other people. And it's like we have to learn about ourselves, but oftentimes it's like a connection or a disconnection with someone else that's like, oh, maybe I should really be thinking about this. So what's it like to be you? But like, what's it like to be me? I haven't even explored that. And, to your point, race is something for me that is top of mind all the time. And there's lots of times I'll be in a space and I'll say to someone like, I'm the only black person in here, right? And then people are like, oh, I never thought of that. It's like, oh yeah, that was the first thing. And I know that. I
Mhm.
know where I am. I show up, and I'm like, yep, it's probably only going to be me or me and one other person. Or if I'm expecting someone else and they don't show up, I'm like, hey, you left me because I thought it was going to be you and me or whatever it might be. So, and I think like that is the reality. And so to think about that experience, like through the lens, like, what is that experience? And people can sometimes go back to an experience they've had, like the first time they have felt discomfort, whether it be like travel, often is an experience people have had, college
Mhm.
or higher education is an experience, military is another experience that for many white people that have shared with me, like those are experiences like that was the first time. And my response, not response, but like as I think about it, I'm like, And so think about like our young people kind of going back to that, like at 4 years old, they're making and seeing those distinctions and they've carried this with them. And for your first time in your 20s, which is also something Dr. D'Angelo
Yeah.
talks about, is like kind of that first
Yeah.
understanding around the social construction of race and like, oh, I'm getting this now. And there's another book, it's a book for educator, not for educators, but it's very relevant to educators. It's by Debbie Irving, called "Waking Up White," and she kind of talks about like
Mm.
she's in her 30s and like woke up one day and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm white, and it's like, yeah, you woke up in your 30s. Like I've been like for my whole life, I've woke up thinking about. I mean, I talked about it, in part one. My earliest experience, like that, when I was my first year in school, like when I had just turned 5 and we were taking the bus across town, like I remember that because it was right shortly after my birthday. As I said, I started school when I was 4, and then so I was pretty young, and then turning 5 was like, yeah, I remember that being so distinct. Like it was right after that because then I was going to start taking the bus by myself, which again, thinking back to, I wish I would have asked my mom because I barely let my children go around the block now, and I was taking the bus across town after we took the bus together a couple times.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. So like having that, and I think for me, really because race is so clear for me, a lens of diversity that I have leaned into really heavily in the last several years has really been around gender and gender identity. And so, as you're talking about like not thinking about being white, like I one didn't think about how being a woman, how I show up as a woman, like in the world of, especially around leadership. That's been a new lens and learning and perspective, and reflection, but also like the way in which I move about with ease being cisgender. So like when I'm going to the bathroom, when I have my
Yeah.
name up, I was just in an interview with someone, and they had no hesitation, called me Miss Snyder. I had no thoughts. And then I thought about it afterwards, like they just made that assumption and that worked for me. And if that didn't work for me, right, what that experience is like. So that's been an area for me in the ways in which on a daily basis, um, gender identity plays a role in which the way I, navigate the world. So like that's been, as I am a practitioner and I want to believe a leader in this space, the work is continuous. And so always doing my own self work, my own learning, especially as we started part 2 around language. Language is always changing and in different, back to culture too. I just wanted to say this because when you're talking about culture, different cultural contexts, language might be different. So
Yeah.
I was working on a community project in around language and terms, and we get asked it all the time in professionally, like, I just want a list of terms. And it's like, a list of terms isn't as helpful in understanding what it means and how people, like when people say to you, I introduce myself as mixed race, like to have the cultural context of what that might mean for them. That's what's important. It's not, it's important about the term because you want to use the same vocabulary that that a person wants you to use, but it's less about that and understanding that the ways in which people identify has meaning and a cultural context that we might not understand. So then how do we learn that, and to engage when we hear something that maybe once was appropriate and now it's not appropriate, or it could be seen as offensive, and vice versa. Terms that were seen or we learned as offensive, and then people use them, and it's like, is that something I can use? And how do you engage in that conversation? Is really the skill in which we need as people to continue the conversation.
I think it would also be really helpful if we would stop choosing language that is naturally going to offend the other side. And so,
Right.
I see myself as an ally and advocate in trying to help the people around me even start asking the questions of what could their experience be and then what is my experience. One of the terms is white privilege. That is
Mm.
very triggering to white people who have not felt privileged, right? So like you
Hmm.
automatically went to an identity in them where they may have experienced true hardship and struggle, and like it's like you're it's part of their personal story and like jabbing them, and then they're not even open to the conversation at all because the term you chose is an attack, right? So it's like if
Hmm.
we could use less aggressive language? I know we want to like have an impact so that there's conversations happening, but are they productive conversations if you started off the bat by attacking somebody? Another one was defunding the police, as one that came out as like, I know police officers that have been begging for extra resources to get more staff, like
Mhm.
social work and everything else, which is literally what defund the police was about, was actually adding resources to the community, taking responsibility away from the police department. But now we're going to choose defund the police. Like that's automatically triggering. So it's like, why do we keep using language that's just going to push us away from each other instead of what is the problem or what is the situation that we want to explore with love and compassion in a way that we really do want to look at it ourselves? Because if you're already
Mhm.
attacking me, I don't want to look at myself.
And I think, yeah, and that's the complexity of it, because I think two things. One, how do we all show up in a more curious way when we hear, like, sometimes I feel like we take terminology and language and then we just run with it and we don't even know what it means. And so then all of a sudden it's like we're
Mhm.
getting behind, and I look at, like, Black Lives Matter, and then kind of the response like Blue Lives Matter. And it's like, do we even
Yeah.
understand what that means? And so then when people sometimes, I think, want to show up as advocates, they get behind things that they don't fully understand yet, because they see that as a way that they're showing up for people. And I think, when we get more curious about understanding our language, and so, like, can we pause, as you're saying, like, sometimes terms are used and then it's just like, well, that's triggering. It's like, can we pause and say, like, when you say that, what do you mean by that? Because again, going
What
back to,
you
like,
actually mean. Hmm.
behavior and language is part of that, right? Is communication. So when someone throws out, like, a term like white privilege without any context or understanding, and we just leave it at that, like, oh, well, that's just white privilege. And it's like, but is it or is it not? Or what does that mean? And when we say privilege, what does that mean? And, like, that is
Hmm.
part of, like, when you talk about, like, that. I love that word because I love digging in and saying, why is that? You talk about triggering, like, why is that triggering? Like, let's have a conversation
Hmm.
about why that is
Hmm.
triggering, and, like, what does that mean? Oh, I understand what when I said this term, this is your context and understanding. And when I said it, this was my context and understanding. And what I've learned in this work is that it's different places. And that's why we
Always,
just kind of
yeah,
walk
almost
away,
always.
right? We walk away and we're
Yeah.
like, oh, well, I can't believe they said that, or whatnot. And one of the things I wanted to mention, as I again just love being in the community that I serve, and, like, it's so important to have these conversations. Was it privileged enough? And I'm using privilege as I just realized as you were saying that. This about the I feel privileged enough to be part of when our community really came together around the aftermath after the murder of George Floyd, and
Yes. Mhm.
being always heavily being involved with our police department since I've been in this community. The chief and I, now the chief, not the chief at the time, said, like, we can't let this, what's happening around the nation, that can't happen here. And what do we need to do? And so what we did is
Mhm.
worked with several other people and came together, and we just started grassroots. Like, what do we need to do? Let's just get started. We can't wait. It's not going to be perfect. We just need to start. And so we ended up putting together a process, I would call it, called Courageous Conversations Around the Dinner Table with Law Enforcement. And it was about having intimate conversations around the topics that were polarizing in other communities. And so things like defund the police or Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter or whatever it might be. And by having those conversations, like, that just created such a, oh, it's so beautiful. Like, we've done several sessions, and it's a small group of people, and then we basically, it's a fishbowl style conversation. And so we have a group of people with a same identity or similar identity, so around being a law enforcement officer, and then a group around, we've done it so far mainly around Black African American. People of color has been another group, and so community members, and so we're engaging across these topics. So first we have a kind of a conversation with people who have a similar identity. Then we have the same questions for people with a different identity, and then we all come together at the end. And it is just so powerful when you just sit down and have that conversation. Like, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for our community? What does this mean? And so it's like that's what we need to do and get curious. And so now when we're saying things, we actually have the context. And so one of the things that for my growth, and again, looking internal first, is I had I would say a visceral, probably is the best way to describe it, reaction when I would see Blue Lives Matter, which is really not what it is. I mean, that's not really anything, even though it was something, but really about the thin blue line. Like I only really saw that after the murder of George Floyd and in response to Black Lives Matter. So when I would see the thin blue line or back the badge or whatnot, and I've had experiences, we never have enough time, but I've had all through my childhood, have had very positive police experiences. People who have really cared for my family in really intimate ways, sitting in my living room while our family was in disarray with officers who I know cared about us, and it made choices so that we could continue to thrive. And so like that had been my experience. So that was my experience coming into Fond du Lac. Always had good experiences as well. And so I was really struggling, like, why am I having this response when I see this? And through those conversations have literally changed. Like I would have that. I mean, it was visceral would be like physiological. Like I would be heated. My heart would be going. I could feel myself getting hot, like literally hot. And I'm like, oh, like, and I would make assumptions and judgment. And so by having these conversations in the work that I have been doing for professionally 20 years, but I would say starting with that conversation when I was 5 years old, and that woman said to my mom,
Mhm.
why is she asking me about you being our grandma? Because the idea of her being our mom as a white woman just was not in this other person's idea of maybe a parent. And
Possibility even.
so,
Yeah.
right, a possibility. And so, like, to be able to practice that, just a few years ago and be able to change my own understanding, and so now I have this whole other context and understanding through conversation. So when I see thin blue line, I understand that there's meaning well before George Floyd about
Way
thin
before,
blue
yeah.
line, and in understanding intimate, intimate, I guess, context in law enforcement culture. As we kind of full circle back to culture, right? There's a culture within
Yeah.
and how people work with one another, and an understanding that I did not have prior. And now it shapes everything else, right? And it's because of that conversation. Had we not sat down and had that conversation with our community and continue to have the conversation, even with the knowledge I had, but those conversations is that was the key to be able to have a different outlook and understanding of us individually as people showing up with who we are in all authentic ways, and being able to just serve in the way that we want to serve and be a community member and be show up as a parent and as a neighbor, and all of the ways that the lenses that we have and the roles in which we play. It starts with that conversation and that connection and creating those spaces to be able to do that. And that is the work. Like that is all the work.
Are those conversations recorded in public somewhere? Is this like a podcast, or is it just in a small group trying to create more understanding within each
Yeah,
other?
it's just a small group. We made an intentional decisions not to record them. We had talked about that because we thought people could learn from the conversations, and yet it was more meaningful for the people in the room having the conversations to have an environment where they could truly be open and honest and just engage
Yes.
with one another without worrying. One of the lenses that we brought up, we think about body worn cameras. I don't show up every day with everything I do being recorded and subject for review,
Yeah.
right? Like that was a lens of like, that's not an understanding and a context I have. Like, so those conversations kind of went two ways with it. But so we made the decision um, for that to be just a shared experience rather than recorded. We kind of talked about the idea like for training or whatnot, and maybe we'll get there. But it's been so meaningful, and I've seen so much awesomeness come out of those conversations for the people involved, and it's certainly brought us closer as a community. And I really think that's why we haven't seen, of all the things that have happened in the last 4 years, why we haven't seen in our own community a huge response to the negative that's destructive, because we have taken the steps to understand and learn about one another as people first. And that's what it's all about.
Where would you recommend our listeners start on this topic? What would you want to leave them with?
Yeah. So, I mean, start with self, right? Like, as we're thinking about us as individuals in the world of diversity, I would say start with self and think about the things you're curious about others, get curious about yourself first. And the second thing, staying with curiosity, is when you are engaged or presented with conflict, value, perspective, experience that's completely different than your own, is to ask yourself a question and not make a judgment initially. Ask yourself a question. The question I ask myself when I'm presented, as I'm a person too, again, leading this work and a learner right along with everyone else, is I wonder what this person's experience has been that's brought them to this understanding, this idea, this belief, whatever perspective. And that keeps me in a place, and I truly stay curious with that. It's not just like oh, I'm just going to ask this and then really be judgmental later. No, it's a true curiosity. And when I stay in that place of curiosity, that has opened up a world of connection that has been just incredible, because it's an invitation for dialogue and conversation. And as a result, I have been in so many conversations around really intimate parts of people's lives that have been that have prevented them from growing in one way or another. And so when they identify that, it kind of relieves them of this burden that they've had to continue to explore or learn. And several specific conversations come to mind, like someone got stuck here, and that's where they've been stuck for 5, 10, 15, 20, a childhood of years, right? Like, because they've had an experience that has created a roadblock for them, and pretty substantial roadblock. And so when we get to that place of just being able to explore and ask questions, and I love that I feel I'm pretty good at creating a space that allows people what they need so that they can just ask questions and just dialogue. I'm here to learn too. I can offer the knowledge I have, and let's learn together the things that neither of us know. so I think people start with self and really getting curious about themselves. Like, why do I do the things I do? Why do I believe this is the way in which I should operate or the world should operate? One small little thing, I think about time. What's my approach to time? How do we think about time? My approach is, I really believe the people in the moment are the most valuable. And it's been a struggle for my 40 years of existence of following a clock and a calendar and an appointment, because when I'm with people, I want to be present and I want to be there. And so that I don't want the clock to dictate that. And so I've struggled with professionally. There's a culture of your calendar and your time, and you show up, early or late or whatever it is. And so that's a great, get curious with yourself. What is my approach to my attitude towards time? Do I get annoyed when people show up late? Is my on time 15 minutes early, or is my on time 15 minutes late? And when people show up differently, how do I feel about that? And where did I get that from? And why does it matter to me? And all those things. Like, those are questions that we can ask ourselves.
Well, speaking of
It's
time,
perfect.
Laurice, I know we had a hard cut, and I'm enjoying what you're saying so much, but I don't want to put you behind on the next
there you go.
space for yourself. Thank you so much for holding this space where we feel comfortable that we can ask the questions. I could keep you for hours, easily. So we are grateful for time that and your knowledge and wisdom. Yes, thank you.
Well,
Maybe we'll have her back.
Yeah, we've been doing Red Couch talks in between the episodes, so I think this is something we have to put on the radar for other individuals to jump in and ask those questions, get curious with us, and have the conversation. This has been so lovely. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your passion and your dreamer and just your sharing your experience and guiding so many people to connect and do that work themselves.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. This has been super fun, and yes, I appreciate you too and what you're bringing. And I really hope that the listeners continue to follow more and more stories as you continue to bring more stories to the forefront. And I appreciate the opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Red Couch. We would love if you would head on over and subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. It helps us tremendously as we rebel against the status quo of disconnection. We need you. We appreciate you. You can also head on over to our website, redcouchrebels.com, to send us a note and explore your inner rebel with us on our online network. We'd love to see you there.